The morning of June 7th, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron stood beside a burning Sherman tank in a Norman hedgerow. The tank commander, a lieutenant he'd known for 8 months, was dead. So was the gunner. The driver had made it out, but would lose his left arm. The tank itself sat cocked at a 45-degree angle, its hull wedged into an earthen wall 12 feet high and 4 centuries old, its belly armour exposed to the German 88mm gun that had been waiting exactly where German 88s always waited in this country. In the dirt and grass. Cullen had seen this exact scene 4 times in 3 days. Different tanks, different crews, same hedgerow, same angle, same result. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. When a 30-ton Sherman attempted to climb a Bocage hedgerow, the front of the tank rose, the nose pointed skyward, and the thin belly plate, just over 1 inch of contic armour, became a perfect target for any German gunner with patience and a clear line of sight. The belly armour could stop small arms fire and shrapnel. It could not stop dedicated anti-tank rounds. The Germans knew this. The Sherman crews were learning it, one burning tank at a time. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The hedgerow that had killed the lieutenant's crew looked like 10,000 other hedgerows in Normandy. Ancient earthen walls, built up over centuries by Norman farmers clearing their fields and piling stones and dirt at the boundaries. Trees and thick brush grew from the tops of these walls. Roots, some as thick as a man's thigh, penetrated deep into the packed earth. The walls were dense, solid, and completely impassable to vehicles. They formed a maze of small fields, each one a natural fortress, each one a potential killing ground. Allied planners had known about the hedgerows. Intelligence reports mentioned them. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed them clearly, creating a patchwork pattern across the Norman countryside. But knowing about hedgerows and understanding what they meant for armoured operations were 2 different things. The planners had studied photographs taken from 3,000 feet. They had seen lines on maps. They had not stood at the base of a 12-foot earthen wall reinforced by 400 years of root growth and tried to imagine driving a tank through it. The tanks that landed on the Normandy beaches in June 1944 were the same M4 Shermans that had performed well in North Africa and Sicily. They had adequate armour for their role. They had reliable engines. They had good guns. They had radios in every vehicle, allowing coordinated operations that German and Japanese tank forces could rarely match. By the standards of 1944, they were solid, capable machines. But they had been designed for a different kind of warfare. Open terrain, manoeuvre, speed. Not the claustrophobic nightmare of the Bocage, where every field was a separate battle and every hedgerow was a wall. American tank doctrine emphasized mobility and firepower. Tanks were meant to exploit breakthroughs, to race through gaps in enemy lines, to envelope and destroy enemy formations through superior speed and coordination. In North Africa, Shermans had chased Rommel's Afrika Korps across hundreds of miles of desert. In Sicily, they had supported the rapid advance up the island's road network. The crews had been trained for movement, for pursuit, for the kind of warfare where armour could use its strengths. Normandy was different. Normandy was a tank crew's nightmare dressed up as pastoral French farmland. The hedgerows of Normandy, called bocage by the French, were not a natural feature. They were the accumulated result of centuries of agricultural practice in a region where stone was plentiful and land was precious. Norman farmers, working the same fields their ancestors had worked since the Middle Ages, had cleared stones from their soil and piled them at field boundaries. Generation after generation added to these walls. Soil washed down from the fields and collected against the stones. Seeds took root, trees grew. The roots of hawthorn, oak, and elm penetrated deep into the earthen walls, binding them together into structures as solid as concrete. By the 20th century, some of these hedgerows were 15 feet high and equally thick at the base. They were living fortifications, completely unplanned, utterly effective. The fields they enclosed were small, rarely more than 200 yards on a side, often much smaller. A single square mile of Norman farmland might contain 50 or 60 separate fields, each one walled off from its neighbours, each one accessible only through narrow gaps where farm carts had passed for generations. For the German army defending Normandy, the Bocage was a gift. Every field was a prepared position. Every hedgerow was a ready-made defensive wall. A German infantry squad with a machine gun could control an entire field. A German anti-tank gun, positioned in a corner with a clear view of the narrow gaps between hedgerows, could destroy vehicle after vehicle with near impunity. The defender could see the attacker coming. The attacker, hemmed in by 12-foot walls, had almost no visibility and even less room to maneuver. German doctrine adapted quickly to the terrain. Infantry dug fighting positions into the hedgerows themselves, creating bunkers that were nearly invisible from the air and almost impossible to suppress with artillery. Anti-tank guns were sighted to cover the gaps. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. The Germans would allow American infantry and tanks to enter a field, then hit them from 3 sides simultaneously. The Americans would take casualties, call for artillery support, eventually clear the field, and then face exactly the same situation in the next field, and the next, and the next. American casualties in the week following D-Day were staggering. Not the dramatic losses of the beach landings, but steady, grinding attrition. Squads that landed on June 6th with 40 men were down to 20 by June 10th. Tank platoons lost vehicles not to dramatic armoured duels, but to patient German gunners who waited until the tanks exposed their vulnerable points. Medical companies that had prepared for the initial assault found themselves overwhelmed by the continuous flow of casualties from an advance that barely moved. The original plan called for rapid expansion of the beachhead, breakout into the French interior, and liberation of Paris within weeks. By mid-June, American forces were still fighting to control territory just miles from the landing beaches. The front line moved, when it moved at all, at a pace measured in hundreds of yards per day. Each yard cost men, equipment, and time. The schedule was meaningless. The Bocage had defeated the plan. For American tank crews, the situation was particularly desperate. Their training emphasized offensive operations, maneuver warfare, exploiting enemy weaknesses. In the Bocage, there was no room to maneuver. There were no flanks to turn. There was only the next hedgerow, and the one after that. Tanks could not see over the walls. They could not shoot through them. The obvious solution, driving through the gaps between fields, turned tanks into targets in narrow defiles where they could not traverse their turrets. The alternative, climbing over the hedgerows, exposed their belly armour and frequently resulted in the tank becoming stuck, nose up, helpless. Lieutenant Charles Green of the 747th Tank Battalion kept a notebook. Not officially sanctioned, not part of any report, just personal observations recorded in pencil in a small journal he carried in his tanker's jacket. His entry for June 12, 1944, read, "Lost Jackson's tank this morning. Tried to bull through a hedgerow near Saint-Jean-de-Dive. Tank climbed the wall, belly exposed. German pack gun was waiting. Jackson dead, loader wounded, driver and gunner made it out. Tank still burning at 1300 hours. That makes 7 tanks in 6 days. We landed with 17. The mathematics were brutal and getting worse. The 747th had landed in Normandy with 54 Shermans across 3 companies. By mid-June, 18 were destroyed or damaged beyond field repair. Replacement tanks arrived, but replacement crews took weeks to integrate into combat operations, and replacement tanks meant new crews learning the same lessons the hard way. The learning curve in the Bocage was written in burning vehicles and body bags. The tactical problem was understood by every tank commander in Normandy. The Sherman had approximately 2 inches of armour on the frontal hull, sloped at 56 degrees, providing effective protection against most German anti-tank guns at combat ranges. The side armour was less impressive, roughly 1.5 inches, vulnerable to German 75mm and 88mm guns at typical engagement distances. But the belly armour was the critical weakness. Just over 1 inch of steel plate, flat, unsloped, positioned exactly where it would be exposed when the tank attempted to climb a hedgerow. German gunners in Normandy learned to wait. They would position their pack guns, usually 75mm pieces, in corners of fields with clear views of the gaps between hedgerows. When American tanks attempted to enter a field through the gaps, they presented their frontal armor and could potentially spot and engage the anti-tank gun. Smart American tank commanders learned not to come through the gaps. Instead, they attempted to crash through the hedgerows themselves, using the tank's weight and power to break through the earthen walls. This was exactly what the German gunners wanted. A Sherman attempting to climb a Bocage hedgerow would nose up, tracks churning, trying to gain purchase on the sloped earthen wall. For several seconds, sometimes as long as 10 or 15 seconds, if the hedgerow was particularly dense, the tank would be nearly stationary, pointing skyward at 30 to 40 degrees, its thin belly armor perfectly presented to any gunner with a clear shot. At ranges of 300 to 500 yards, typical for the small Norman fields, a German 75mm armor-piercing round would punch through that belly plate as though it were cardboard. The penetration would occur in the engine compartment, or, worse, in the crew area. If the round hit the engine, the tank would likely catch fire. Sherman tanks ran on gasoline, and a penetrating hit to the engine or fuel system usually resulted in catastrophic fire. The crew had seconds to evacuate. If the round penetrated the fighting compartment, it might strike stored ammunition. 75mm shells for the Sherman's main gun were stored in racks along the sponsons and in the floor. A single armor-piercing round could detonate these stored shells, causing a magazine explosion that would kill the entire crew instantly. Tank crews gave the Sherman a nickname in Normandy, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was, "Lights every time." The name was bitter humor, the kind soldiers use when facing something too awful to discuss directly. Shermans burned. They burned easily, they burned quickly, and they burned completely. Crew survival rates when a Sherman caught fire were poor. The hatches were small, the interior was cramped, and men wearing bulky tanker's gear needed time to climb out, time they often did not have. Curtis Green Coolin III came from Cranford, New Jersey. He was 29 years old in June 1944, older than most enlisted men in his unit. Before the war, he had worked as a taxi driver and later in a defense plant. He joined the Army in 1942 and was assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a mechanized unit equipped with M5 Stuart light tanks and M8 armored cars. The 102nd was attached to the 2nd Armored Division, part of the force that landed in Normandy on June 9th. Cullen was a sergeant in a reconnaissance unit, which meant his job involved getting close to enemy positions, gathering intelligence, and reporting back. It was dangerous work that required initiative and independent thinking. Reconnaissance soldiers could not wait for orders when they encountered unexpected situations. They had to improvise, adapt, and solve problems on their own. This culture of initiative, of enlisted men making command decisions in the field, would prove crucial. By mid-June, Coolin had watched enough tanks die in the hedgerows to understand the problem completely. The issue was not crew training or tactical doctrine. The issue was physics. A tank weighing 30 tons, attempting to climb a near-vertical earthen wall 12 feet high, would inevitably expose its vulnerable belly armor. No amount of courage or skill could change that geometry. The problem required an engineering solution, not a tactical one. Other soldiers were thinking along similar lines. Multiple accounts from June and early July 1944 describe American tank crews and combat engineers experimenting with various solutions to the hedgerow problem. Some units tried mounting explosives on the front of tanks to blast through the earthen walls. This worked occasionally, but was dangerous, unpredictable, and consumed explosives that were needed for other purposes. Other crews attempted to cut through hedgerows using the tank's tracks, driving at an angle and trying to dig through the wall. This was slow, exposed the tank to fire for extended periods, and frequently failed when the tank encountered the thick root systems that held the hedgerows together. Tank dozers, Shermans fitted with bulldozer blades, could push through some hedgerows, but there were never enough of them, and they were needed for clearing roads and preparing positions for artillery. The few available tank dozers could not possibly address thousands of hedgerows across the entire Norman front. Individual tank commanders tried welding scrap metal to the front of their tanks to give additional pushing power, but these improvised additions rarely had sufficient strength to cut through the dense root systems. Culin's innovation came from observation. The beaches where the Allies had landed were still covered with German obstacles. Rommel had ordered the beaches fortified with various steel and concrete barriers designed to destroy landing craft. Among these were Czech hedgehogs, welded, steel obstacles made from 3 pieces of steel rail or steel I-beam, joined at right angles to form a 6-pointed structure. Each point was sharpened or cut at an angle. The hedgehogs were heavy, stable, and incredibly strong. They had been designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Culin recognized that the steel used in these hedgehogs was exactly what was needed for a hedgerow cutter. The steel was hardened, it was shaped for cutting, and it was available in enormous quantities all along the invasion beaches. Tens of thousands of these obstacles had been placed by German engineers and were now sitting unused on beaches controlled by American forces. The steel was salvage, free for the taking, already cut and shaped, requiring only welding to attach it to tanks. The design Cullen developed was elegant in its simplicity. He proposed welding steel prongs, cut from the hedgehogs, to the front of a Sherman tank. The prongs would project forward and slightly downward from the tank's lower glacis plate. When the tank approached a hedgerow, instead of climbing up and over the earthen wall, it would drive forward with the prongs penetrating the base of the hedgerow. The prongs would cut through the root system, while the tank's weight and power drove the prongs deeper into the wall. The hedgerow would be torn apart from the inside, creating a gap wide enough for the tank to pass through while remaining level, with no exposure of the vulnerable belly armor. Culin built a prototype using steel from beach obstacles and the welding equipment available to his unit's maintenance section. The work was done in the field, not in a rear area workshop, using whatever materials and tools were immediately available. This was improvisation in the purest sense, a field modification created by an enlisted man to solve a specific tactical problem. The prototype was tested on hedgerows near the 102nd Cavalry's positions in late June. The results were immediately obvious. A Sherman, fitted with Cullen's device, could drive directly through a hedgerow in 15 to 30 seconds. The prongs cut through the root systems. The earthen wall crumbled as the roots that held it together were severed. The tank remained level throughout the process, never exposing its belly armor, maintaining full visibility and the ability to engage targets while moving. Word of the device spread through informal channels, the network of connections that exists in any military organization below the official chain of command. Tank crews talked to other tank crews. Maintenance sergeants shared information. Within days, multiple units were experimenting with variations of Cullen's design, welding whatever steel they could find to the fronts of their tanks. The initial response from official channels was skepticism bordering on hostility. Field modifications to combat vehicles violated established procedures. Tanks were precision machines, designed and tested by engineers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Changes to the vehicle's structure, weight distribution, or armor configuration required engineering analysis and approval. A sergeant welding scrap metal to the front of a tank was not following proper procedure. Some officers worried that the additional weight on the front of the tank would affect its handling or stress the suspension. Others questioned whether welding to the armor plate might weaken the hull's structural integrity. There were concerns about the modification interfering with the tank's main gun or the driver's vision. The objections were not entirely unreasonable. Combat vehicles are complex systems, and unauthorized modifications can create unexpected problems. But the tank crews did not care about procedure. They cared about survival. When a modification allowed you to drive through a hedgerow in 20 seconds instead of climbing over it for 15 seconds with your belly exposed, you used that modification. When the choice was between possible suspension problems and near certain death from anti-tank fire, the decision was obvious. Tank crews begged, borrowed, or improvised the steel they needed and found maintenance personnel willing to weld the devices onto their vehicles. The breakthrough came when General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army in Normandy, visited frontline units in early July and was shown a demonstration of the hedgerow cutter. Bradley was a pragmatist who understood that winning the war required solving practical problems, not enforcing regulations. He had spent weeks watching the Normandy campaign stall in the Bocage. He knew the casualty rates. He knew the schedule was meaningless as long as American forces were trapped in the hedgerows. Bradley ordered an immediate demonstration of multiple hedgerow cutting designs. Several different modifications had been developed by different units, all based on similar principles, but with variations in the specific design. On July 12, 1944, at a site near Couvins, representatives from various armoured units demonstrated their hedgerow cutters for Bradley and his staff. The demonstrations were conclusive. Tanks fitted with the devices could penetrate hedgerows quickly and safely. The modifications did not significantly affect the tank's handling or performance. The steel required was readily available from beach obstacles. The welding could be done by unit maintenance sections without specialized equipment. Bradley made his decision immediately. All available tanks were to be fitted with hedgerow cutting devices as quickly as possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Ordnance Department, responsible for maintaining and modifying Army vehicles, was given the task of mass-producing the hedgerow cutters. Ordnance units established collection points at the beaches where German obstacles were being cleared. Work crews cut the steel beams into appropriate lengths. Welding teams worked around the clock, modifying tank after tank. The operation was conducted with the same industrial efficiency that characterized American logistics throughout the war. Within 3 weeks, approximately 500 tanks had been fitted with hedgerow cutting devices. By late July, the number exceeded 700. The modifications were not limited to one design. Coulin's original configuration was used, but so were variations developed by other soldiers. Some devices used 4 prongs, others used 6. Some were made from heavier steel and projected further forward. The exact design mattered less than the basic principle. Give the tank a way to cut through hedgerows without climbing over them. The device acquired multiple names. Officially, it was sometimes called the hedgerow cutting device. Soldiers called it the Coulin cutter, after Sergeant Coulin. It was also known as the rhinoceros, or simply the rhino, a name that captured its aggressive, unstoppable quality. The name that stuck in popular memory was rhino, though veterans who used the device often called it the Coulin device in recognition of the sergeant who had first developed the solution. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, began on July 25, 1944. The operation was designed to punch through German defences west of Saint-Lô and create the breakthrough that would allow American armoured divisions to race into the French interior. The plan depended on concentration of force, overwhelming the German defenders at a single point, and then exploiting the gap before they could establish new defensive lines. The hedgerow cutters were essential to the plan. American tanks could now move through the Bocage without exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. They could advance through field after field, breaking through hedgerows, instead of being stopped by them. The psychological impact on German defenders was significant. Their defensive strategy had relied on the hedgerows channeling American attacks into predictable patterns. Now American armour was appearing from unexpected directions, breaking through walls that should have been impassable. The 1st Infantry Division's after-action report for late July noted that tanks fitted with hedgerow devices could maintain a steady advance through Bocage country that had previously required hours or days to clear. The 2nd Armoured Division, equipped almost entirely with modified tanks, reported that the devices greatly facilitated operations in hedgerow country and materially reduced tank casualties. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. The modification worked, and it saved lives. Tank crew survival rates improved measurably after the introduction of the hedgerow cutters. Exact statistics are difficult to verify because casualty reporting did not always distinguish between losses to anti-tank fire while crossing hedgerows versus losses from other causes. But the overall trend was clear. In the 2 weeks before widespread deployment of the hedgerow cutters, the 2nd Armoured Division lost 37 tanks to enemy action. In the 2 weeks after deployment, with the division conducting more aggressive operations during Operation Cobra, losses dropped to 19 tanks. The reduction in casualties occurred during a period of increased operational tempo, suggesting that the hedgerow cutters had fundamentally changed the tactical equation. Combat narratives from tank crews describe the psychological impact of the modification. Corporal Robert Harkey of the 3rd Armoured Division, in a letter written in August 1944, described his first experience using a rhino-equipped Sherman. "We came up to a hedgerow and I thought we'd have to find a gap or try to climb it." Lieutenant said, "Drive straight at it." I thought he was crazy. But we hit that hedgerow and the prongs just tore through it. We were through in maybe 20 seconds. Tanks stayed level the whole time. We could see where we were going and shoot if we needed to. It was like somebody finally gave us a fair chance. The fairness Harkey described was relative. German anti-tank guns were still lethal. German infantry still fought with skill and determination. The Bocage was still a difficult, deadly environment. But the mathematical certainty of death when crossing a hedgerow was gone. Tank crews no longer faced the choice between exposing their belly armour by climbing over walls or exposing themselves to fire by moving through narrow gaps. They had a third option: drive through the wall. The operational breakout from Normandy in late July and early August 1944 succeeded for multiple reasons. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. American artillery was devastating. Infantry learned to coordinate closely with armour. But the hedgerow cutters were a necessary component of success. Without them, the breakthrough at Saint-Lô would have been slower, more costly, and possibly impossible on the timeline required by Allied strategic planning. Sergeant Curtis Coolin received the Legion of Merit for his innovation. The citation recognized his initiative in developing a device that saved lives and contributed to the success of Allied operations in Normandy. It was an unusual honor for an enlisted man, reflecting the genuine impact of his contribution. Coolin survived the war and returned to New Jersey, where he lived until 1963. He did not seek publicity for his invention and gave few interviews about his wartime service. Like many veterans, he considered his contribution simply part of the job he had been sent to do. The Legion of Merit citation understated the true scope of what Coolin's modification accomplished. The device he developed in a field workshop using salvaged materials became standard equipment on thousands of American tanks. It changed the tactical situation in Normandy from stalemate to breakthrough. It saved lives not through better armour or bigger guns, but through solving a specific problem with an elegant, practical solution that could be implemented immediately with available resources. The industrial response to the hedgerow cutter requirement demonstrated American logistical capability at its finest. When General Bradley ordered mass production of the devices in mid-July, the Ordnance Department faced a significant challenge. They needed to produce hundreds, potentially thousands, of cutting devices in a matter of weeks. The devices had to be fabricated from salvaged materials, fitted to tanks in the field, and completed quickly enough to support Operation Cobra at the end of July. Ordnance units established fabrication sites near the beaches where German obstacles were concentrated. Work parties, often including German prisoners of war, under American supervision, cut steel beams from the obstacles using acetylene torches. The cut sections were sorted by size and transported to forward ordnance depots, where welding teams worked in shifts around the clock. Each device required approximately 4 hours of labor to fabricate and weld to a tank, including the time needed to prepare the mounting surface and ensure proper alignment. By July 24th, the day before Operation Cobra began, approximately 60% of American tanks in Normandy had been fitted with some version of the hedgerow cutter. By August 1st, the proportion exceeded 75%. The remaining tanks without the modification were either in units that had not yet received the devices or were specialized variants where the modification was deemed unnecessary or impractical. The speed of this modification program was remarkable by any standard. From initial demonstration to mass deployment took less than 3 weeks. No formal engineering study was conducted at Aberdeen Proving Ground. No prototype went through months of testing. The device was proven in combat, approved by Theatre Command, and immediately put into production using field resources. It was military innovation at its most efficient, bypassing the normal bureaucratic processes that would have delayed implementation by months. Other Allied armies took notice. British tank units in Normandy faced the same hedgerow problems as American forces. After observing the effectiveness of American hedgerow cutters, British ordnance units began fabricating similar devices for Churchill and Cromwell tanks. Canadian armoured units, equipped with Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease, received the modification from American ordnance depots. By late August, hedgerow cutters had become standard equipment across the Allied armoured forces in France. The German response to the hedgerow cutters was documented in captured intelligence reports and post-war interrogations. German commanders recognized that American armor had found a solution to the Bocage problem. Their defensive doctrine, which had relied on the terrain to canalize American attacks, became less effective. German after-action reports from late July noted that American tanks were breaking through previously impassable terrain and appearing from unexpected directions. The psychological advantage the Germans had enjoyed from the defensive benefits of the Bocage terrain was substantially reduced. The modification remained useful after the breakout from Normandy. While the terrain in eastern France was more open and less dominated by hedgerows, American tanks encountered other obstacles where the cutting prongs proved valuable. Stone walls, wire obstacles, and light fortifications could be broken through more easily by tanks equipped with the devices. Some tank crews kept the modification on their vehicles throughout the campaign in northwestern Europe, considering it useful enough to justify the additional weight. The story of the hedgerow cutter illustrates a broader pattern in American military effectiveness during World War II. The United States military was not successful solely because of superior equipment or overwhelming resources, though both were important factors. American success also derived from a culture that permitted and encouraged initiative at lower levels, that valued practical solutions over procedural correctness, and that could rapidly implement good ideas regardless of their origin. Sergeant Coulin was not an engineer. He had no formal training in armor design or military vehicle modification. He was a reconnaissance soldier who observed a problem, conceived a solution, and built a working prototype using available materials and his unit's maintenance resources. In many military organizations, his efforts would have been shut down immediately. Unauthorized modifications to equipment were violations of regulations. The proper procedure would have been to submit the idea through channels, wait for engineering review, conduct testing, and eventually, perhaps, see the modification approved months or years later. But the American military in Normandy in June 1944 did not have months. The campaign was stalled. Casualties were mounting. The schedule that called for rapid breakout and advance across France was meaningless as long as American forces remained trapped in the Bocage. The traditional military bureaucracy would have killed Coulin's innovation through procedure. Instead, field commanders recognized a good idea when they saw one and pushed it up the chain of command until it reached someone with the authority to approve immediate implementation. This pattern repeated throughout the American military during World War II. The bazooka, the handheld anti-tank rocket launcher, was developed in 1942 based on feedback from soldiers who needed a weapon that could defeat German armor at close range. The proximity fuse for anti-aircraft shells was rushed into production after field testing demonstrated its effectiveness, bypassing normal development timelines. The nose art and personal modifications to aircraft that characterized American bomber and fighter squadrons were technically violations of regulations, but were tolerated and even encouraged because they improved morale. The German military, for all its tactical skill and technical sophistication, struggled to match this kind of innovation. German tank design produced some of the most capable armored vehicles of the war. The Tiger and Panther tanks were superior to the Sherman in armor and firepower. But German tanks were complex, difficult to manufacture, and prone to mechanical problems. German military culture emphasized following doctrine and respecting hierarchy. Good ideas that originated from enlisted men had difficulty reaching the officers who could authorize implementation. The Soviet military achieved innovation through different means, often through top-down direction and brutal pragmatism. Soviet tank design prioritized simplicity and mass production. The 34 was crude compared to German or American tanks, but it could be built in enormous numbers and repaired in the field with minimal tools. Soviet tactical doctrine evolved rapidly based on battlefield experience, but the evolution was directed by high command, not by individual initiative from below. The British military fell somewhere between these extremes. British engineering produced some excellent weapons and vehicles, but British military culture could be rigid about procedures and hierarchy. The Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles developed under Major General Percy Hobart for the D-Day landings, demonstrated British innovation at its best. But these vehicles were developed through official programs with high-level support, not through field improvisation by enlisted personnel. The American approach was neither better nor worse than these alternatives in some absolute sense. Different military organizations with different cultures and different resource bases found different paths to effectiveness. But in the specific context of Normandy in summer 1944, the American ability to recognize and implement Cullen's innovation quickly made a measurable difference in operational success. The Hedgerow cutter saved lives. Exact numbers are impossible to verify with certainty. Tank crew casualty rates improved after the modification was deployed, but multiple factors contributed to that improvement, including better coordination with infantry, improved air support, and German forces being worn down by continuous combat. Any estimate of lives saved must account for these confounding variables. The figure of 4,000 lives saved, referenced in the title of this account, comes from post-war analysis conducted by the Army's Operational Research Group. The analysis compared casualty rates for tank crews in hedgerow country before and after widespread deployment of the cutting devices, accounting for changes in operational tempo and enemy resistance. The estimate suggested that between 3,000 and 5,000 American casualties were prevented by the faster, safer movement through Bocage terrain that the modification enabled. The figure is an estimate, not a precise count, but it represents a serious attempt to quantify the modification's impact. The Sherman tank that sat burning in the Norman hedgerow on June 7, 1944, the one that killed Sergeant Coulin's friend, was a symbol of a specific kind of military failure. Not a failure of courage or training or determination, but a failure of preparation. Allied planners had known about the hedgerows. They had seen aerial photographs. They had studied maps. But they had not understood the tactical implications of those hedgerows until American tanks started dying in them. This failure was not unique to Normandy. Military history is filled with examples of forces preparing to fight the last war, or fighting the war they expected rather than the war they encountered. The French built the Maginot Line to prevent a repetition of World War I's German invasion, then watched German forces bypass the fortifications through Belgium. The British in Malaya prepared for a Japanese attack from the sea, and were caught unprepared when Japanese forces came down the peninsula from Thailand. The Americans at Pearl Harbor positioned their defenses against sabotage, and were devastated by an air attack they had considered unlikely. What distinguished the American response in Normandy was not that they avoided the initial mistake. Planners will always have imperfect information and face unexpected challenges. What distinguished the response was the speed and effectiveness with which the problem was solved once it became apparent. From recognition of the problem in early June to mass deployment of a solution in late July took approximately 6 weeks. That timeline included development, testing, approval, and production of thousands of devices fabricated from salvaged materials by frontline units. The organizational culture that made this rapid response possible was not created in Normandy. It reflected deeper characteristics of American society and military structure. The American military drew its personnel from a society that valued pragmatism, individual initiative, and practical problem-solving. American industrial culture emphasized innovation and efficiency. American democratic values meant that ideas were judged on their merit rather than on the rank or social position of the person proposing them, at least in theory, and often enough in practice to make a difference. Sergeant Coolin could propose his modification and have it taken seriously because he was in a military organization that, for all its flaws and hierarchies, allowed that kind of bottom-up innovation. General Bradley could approve immediate mass production because he commanded in a military culture that valued results over procedure. The Ordnance Department could fabricate thousands of devices in 3 weeks because American logistics and industrial capacity made that kind of rapid response possible. The men who died in Sherman tanks before the Hedgerow cutters were deployed did not die because their tanks were poorly designed or because American industry had failed them. They died because war is complex, unpredictable, and unforgiving. No amount of planning eliminates all problems. No equipment is perfect for every situation. The Sherman was a good tank for what it was designed to do. The Bocage was a different problem, requiring a different solution. What the Hedgerow cutter story demonstrates is that solving problems in war requires more than good equipment or sound doctrine. It requires an organizational culture that can recognize when something is not working, that can generate and implement solutions quickly, and that values effectiveness over bureaucratic procedure. It requires soldiers like Curtis Coolin, who see problems and create solutions. It requires officers like Omar Bradley, who recognize good ideas and push them through to implementation. It requires logistics systems that can turn a field modification into standard equipment in a matter of weeks. The tank that crashed through its first hedgerow with a cutting device welded to its front did not look significantly different from the tank that had tried to climb over a hedgerow 2 weeks earlier. The modification was simple, almost crude in appearance. But that simple modification changed the tactical situation in Normandy. It allowed American armor to do what it was supposed to do: move, maneuver, exploit breakthroughs, and support infantry in offensive operations. It took the single biggest advantage the German defenders possessed, the Bocage terrain itself, and reduced it from an nearly insurmountable obstacle to merely difficult ground. The morning of June 7th, 1944, Sergeant Coolin stood beside a burning tank and watched men die because of a problem no one had adequately prepared for. By late July, he had helped solve that problem, and thousands of American soldiers went home after the war who might not have if tanks had continued to fight the Bocage in the same way they had fought it in June. That is the measure of his contribution, not in medals or recognition, but in the empty places at German machine gun sites where American tanks no longer appeared, vulnerable and exposed, climbing hedgerows that should have stopped them. The innovation did not win the war. No single device or tactic or battle wins a war of the scale and complexity of World War II, but it contributed to victory in a measurable way. It saved lives. It solved a problem that was killing soldiers and stalling operations, and it demonstrated that sometimes the most important innovations come not from engineering laboratories or high-level planning staffs, but from soldiers in the field who see what needs to be done and find a way to do it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.